The grand assembly hall stretched far across the polished black floor, and the ceiling was so high, it seemed to touch the stars themselves because it was made to look like the home skies of 1,000 different worlds. And Elder Keeper Vornthax stood in the center of this massive room with his 6 eyes looking tired from all the years he had lived, and he was about to call a meeting that would change everything for the galaxy and for the humans who sat quietly in the lower section of the hall waiting to speak their case. The hall was filled with representatives from 800 different species, and each one had traveled from distant stars to be here for this important discussion, and the air hummed with the sound of translation, devices that let everyone understand each other no matter what language they spoke, and Vornthax raised one of his long arms to signal that the meeting would begin, and the room fell silent, except for the soft buzzing of the technology that kept them all connected. Captain Daniel Price sat in the human section with his team, and he wore a simple uniform that had no decorations or medals because humans believed in being practical rather than showy, and next to him sat Lieutenant Commander Lisa Martin, who was reviewing information on her tablet, and on his other side was Commander Jack Sullivan, who was reading through trade agreements and economic reports, and all three of them looked calm, but inside they were preparing for what they knew would be a difficult conversation. Vornthax began speaking, and his voice came through the translation system in every language at once, and he said that they were here to discuss a serious problem between the humans and the Zormach Dominion, and that the Zormach had filed complaints about human settlements in star systems that the Zormach claimed were theirs by ancient right, and the room stirred with interest because conflicts over territory were not common in the Coalition, which had kept peace for 12,000 years through careful talking and compromise. A massive creature covered in red scales stood up from the Zormach section, and his size alone was impressive, because he was 3 times taller than any human, and his voice was deep and threatening when he spoke through the translators, and he said that humans had invaded 17 star systems that belonged to the Zormach people for 6,000 years, and that this was an insult to ancient traditions, and that the humans must leave immediately and pay for the damage they had caused. Daniel Price stood slowly, and his movement was simple and direct without any drama, and he adjusted his uniform and looked directly at the Zormach ambassador and said in a clear voice that the star systems in question had no inhabitants and no legal claims according to Coalition law, and that humans had followed every rule and every procedure, and had filed all the correct paperwork, and had waited the required time before settling, and that they had broken no laws whatsoever. The Zormach ambassador made a hissing sound that the translators interpreted as anger, and he said that law was not the same as respect, and that humans moved too fast and claimed too much, and never asked permission from the species who had been in space for thousands of years before humans even discovered fire. And Daniel replied calmly that humans asked permission from the law, and that should be enough for anyone in the Coalition. Vornthax watched this exchange with growing worry because he had seen something like this before in the old records that only Elder Keepers were allowed to read, and those records warned about certain patterns of behavior and certain mistakes that could lead to terrible outcomes, and he was beginning to see those patterns now in how the humans were responding to the accusations. The debate went on for many hours, and different species offered suggestions and compromises, and tried to find middle ground between what the Zormach wanted and what the humans would accept. But Daniel and his team politely refused every compromise, and their refusal was not angry or loud, but it was absolutely firm, and they said again and again that they would not give up territory that was legally theirs under Coalition law. Vornthax noticed something that made his old hearts beat faster with concern, and it was that the humans were becoming quieter as the debate continued, and Daniel spoke less often, and when he did speak, his sentences were shorter and more precise, and Lisa Martin had stopped taking notes on her tablet, and Jack Sullivan's face showed no emotion at all, and this quietness was not the quietness of defeat, but something else entirely, and Vornthax recognized it from the ancient warnings. Finally, after hours of back and forth, the Zormach ambassador delivered his final demand, and he said that humans must withdraw from all 17 systems within 1 month or face the consequences. And the way he said consequences made it clear he meant military action and violence and war. And the room became tense because the Coalition had not seen war between member species in thousands of years. Daniel Price stood for the last time, and he was quiet for a moment before speaking. And when he did speak, his voice was calm, but there was something in it that made everyone listen carefully, and he said that humans would not withdraw from legally claimed territory, and that if the coalition wanted to change its laws about claiming systems, then humans would participate in that discussion, but that they would not be bullied into abandoning their rights. The Zormach ambassador's tail moved angrily, and he said, "Then we will make you withdraw." And there was silence in the hall after those words because everyone understood that this was a direct threat of violence, and Daniel was quiet for 3 long seconds. And then he nodded once and said in a voice that was almost too quiet, "Then this discussion is over," and he turned to Lisa and Jack and said, "We are leaving." Vornthax felt something he had not felt in centuries, and it was fear, and he called out to Daniel, and his voice had urgency that was not proper for diplomatic meetings, and he said, "Please, Ambassador Price, let us continue discussion, and that there was always room for more talking." Daniel paused at the entrance and looked back at Vornthax, and he said that humans came here in good faith and followed all the laws and made their case and were threatened with violence for exercising their legal rights, and that there was nothing more to discuss. Vornthax tried again and said that the coalition had maintained peace for 12,000 years through discussion, and Daniel replied that then the coalition should have discussed this with the Zormach before they threatened humans. And Lisa Martin spoke for the first time in 2 hours and said this quietly, and it was clear she was done being patient. The human delegation walked toward the exit, and Vornthax felt panic rising, and he called out again and said, "Please, honored guests, do not walk away in silence," and his voice carried the weight of ancient knowledge and fear. Daniel stopped at the doorway and turned back, and Vornthax saw something in the human's eyes that he recognized from the old records, and it was not anger, because anger could be reasoned with, and it was not frustration, because frustration could be calmed, and it was something far more dangerous and final. And it was decision, Daniel said in a voice that carried across the silent hall, that they were not silent, and that they were done talking. And then the doors closed behind the human delegation, and the room stayed quiet. For a long moment, Vornthax immediately accessed the restricted archives that only Elder Keepers could read, and he found the passage he was looking for, and it was written 8,000 years ago by Elder Keeper Malthuros, and it said, "Beware the quiet human, because when they rage they can be reasoned with, and when they argue they still seek resolution. But when they go silent and walk away, they have already decided what comes next, and they will not be stopped by words, ever again." Vornthax looked at the Zormach delegation who were celebrating because they thought they had won, and he thought to himself that they were fools who had no idea what they had just done. And he knew that the galaxy was about to learn a hard lesson about what happens when you let a human walk away in silence. 3 weeks passed after the humans walked out of the assembly hall, and during those weeks Vornthax watched the reports coming in from across the galaxy with growing dread, because he understood what was happening even if others did not. And the human colonies in the disputed star systems had not evacuated as the Zormach demanded, but instead they had gone quiet in their communications, and what little information came out suggested they were building something, but no one knew exactly. What in the Coalition Intelligence Center, Vornthax studied the data with his assistant Ralmina, who was also from the Altheri species, and she looked at the same reports and said that the humans were clearly fortifying their positions and building defensive structures and orbital platforms, but nothing that seemed offensive, and maybe they would just defend their claims and wait for the Zormach to back down. Vornthax shook his head slowly and said that the humans were preparing for something much bigger than simple defense, and that they were not just getting ready to protect what they had, but getting ready for whatever they had decided when they walked out of that meeting. And Ralmina asked what he thought they were preparing for, and Vornthax said he believed they were preparing for war, but not the kind of war anyone expected. The Zormach Dominion was assembling a fleet just as they had threatened, and it was an impressive show of military power with 47 warships, each one a masterpiece of engineering that had defended Zormach territory for centuries. And the coalition issued statements asking everyone to show restraint, but took no real action to stop what was coming, and most species seemed to think the humans would back down when they saw such overwhelming force. Vornthax tried to warn the Coalition Security Council about what he saw in the patterns of human behavior, and he told them they were making a catastrophic mistake, and that human history showed clear patterns of how they responded to existential threats. But the Vrelian security chief dismissed his concerns and said that humans were too new to space and too divided among themselves to pose any real challenge to an established military power like the Zormach. The security chief said that the Zormach fleet was formidable and that humans would back down when they saw it coming, and Vornthax insisted that the chief had not studied humans closely enough, and that yes, humans fought among themselves often, but when they perceived a threat to their entire species or a fundamental injustice, they unified in ways that were terrifying, and that when they went quiet, it meant the switch had been thrown. Vornthax pulled up files from human history to show the Security Council, and he displayed images of human wars where entire cities had been reduced to ash and weapons that poisoned the very ground, and conflicts that killed not thousands or millions, but hundreds of millions. And he said these were wars humans fought against themselves, and asked the Council to imagine what humans would do to an external enemy if they were truly threatened. He reminded them of the Kelshan War 230 years ago, when humans were new to space and the Kelshan raiders attacked 12 human colonies and killed millions, and the human government filed protests and sought coalition help, but was ignored, and then the humans went quiet for 17 days. And when they emerged from that silence, they had retooled their entire civilization for war, and in 6 months they had driven the Kelshan back, and in 8 months the Kelshan Empire no longer existed. The security chief said that the Kelshan were just raiders, and not a real military power. But Vornthax pointed out that the Kelshan had terrorized the outer regions of the galaxy for 400 years, and dozens of coalition species paid them tribute rather than fight them, and the humans destroyed them in less than 1 year, but the Security Council would not listen, and they said the Zormach fleet would launch in 2 days and they would see what happened, and Vornthax left the meeting knowing that his warnings had been ignored, and he went back to his private archive and began writing a document for future Elder Keepers so they would understand what had happened here. He titled the document, "The Third Critical Error in Managing Human Relations," and he wrote that the first error was assuming human emotions made them weak when in fact it made them unpredictable and dangerous, and the second error was assuming their short lives made them impulsive when in fact it made them ambitious and aggressive, because they tried to accomplish in decades what other species took centuries to do. The third error, he wrote, was the one happening now, and it was assuming that human silence meant human acceptance when in fact it meant human decision, and that was the most dangerous thing of all on the human colony of New Dakota. In one of the disputed systems, Governor Paul Anderson stood with Colonel Amy Foster watching the defensive preparations, and Amy said the Zormach fleet would arrive in 48 hours, and asked if they were ready. Paul said they were ready for defense and that they could make the Zormach pay dearly for every meter of ground. But Amy pointed out that eventually the Zormach would overwhelm them with superior numbers, and she suggested evacuating the civilians while there was still time. Paul refused and said no evacuations, and Amy argued that they could have massive civilian casualties if this went badly, but Paul's face was hard as stone, and he said the moment they evacuated they admitted they did not belong here, and that they had been legally wronged and the coalition had failed them, and Earth had been silent for 3 weeks because they were not wasting time talking anymore but were doing something. Amy asked what they were doing, and Paul said they were making sure the Zormach would regret this for whatever time they had left as a species. And Amy felt a chill run through her, because she had served with Paul during the Kelshan War, and she knew that tone in his voice. On Earth in the Defense Coordination Center, Helen Brooks received a visitor, and Admiral Richard Hayes entered her office and said simply that it was done, and that Operation Silent Answer was ready to execute. Helen looked up from her displays and asked about the Zormach fleet, and Richard said it was tracked and targeted, and that the moment the Zormach fired on New Dakota, the human response would begin. Helen asked if the coalition would condemn them, and Richard said to let them condemn, because Daniel was right, that humans were done asking permission to exist, and Helen asked how many ships were involved in the operation. Richard said 212 ships, and that every combat-capable vessel humanity possessed was now assigned to this operation, and that they had pulled ships from every sector, and that Earth herself had minimal defense at the moment, because everything was committed to this response. Helen asked about the targets, and Richard's face showed no emotion as he said, "Every Zormach," Military installation and every shipyard and every orbital platform and every defensive satellite would be destroyed, and that they were not targeting civilians or colonies. But the Zormach ability to wage war would cease to exist approximately 4 hours after they attacked New Dakota. Helen was quiet for a moment and then said that was comprehensive, and Richard replied that the Zormach threatened humans with violence for following the law, and that they were about to learn what human violence actually looked like. Helen said the coalition would try to intervene, but Richard told her that all human ambassadors and diplomats and observers had already been withdrawn from coalition space and were coming home, and that they had sent the coalition a message saying you can have your coalition without us, or you can have your coalition with us as equals. But you do not get to have a coalition where we obey your laws and receive none of the protections. Helen pulled up a star map and saw red markers for Zormach positions and blue markers for human fleet positions, and the blue markers outnumbered the red by a significant margin. And she asked quietly when they had built so many ships. Richard explained they had not just built new ships but had converted every bulk freighter and every mining vessel and every long-range transport into weapons platforms, and that if it could mount a weapon and move faster than light, it was now part of the fleet. And the Zormach thought they were facing the human military, but they were actually facing human civilization itself. Helen asked how long they could sustain this level of mobilization, and Richard said it did not matter because this would be over in a week, one way or another, and Helen authorized the operation with her biometric signature and said, "Then let us make sure it ends in our favor far across the galaxy." Vornthax felt the quantum fluctuations that his species was sensitive to, and it was like a precognitive awareness of probability streams, and every stream he could perceive led to fire and destruction and violence. He sent one final message to the Coalition Security Council, and he wrote that they had allowed a human delegation to walk away in silence, and that they had perhaps 3 days to undo this mistake before it became irreversible, and that after that point, they would all learn again why elder species feared humanity's potential. But the message was filed and ignored, just like all his other warnings. The Zormach fleet launched on schedule and began its journey to New Dakota, and the humans stopped talking entirely, and Vornthax knew that the galaxy was about to change forever. The Zormach fleet arrived at the edge of the New Dakota system in perfect military formation, and their 47 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel, broadcasting their dominance across every communication frequency, and Admiral Kreshitar commanded from the flagship Endless Vengeance, and he looked at his tactical displays with satisfaction, because everything was going exactly as planned. His tactical officer reported that the humans had only 12 orbital defense platforms and perhaps 30 small patrol craft in the system, and that this represented negligible opposition to the Zormach fleet. And Kreshitar said this was predictable, because humans were a young species who talked loudly, but were ultimately weak when confronted. With real military power, Kreshitar ordered his communications officer to broadcast their final demand on all frequencies, and the message went out in clear human language, saying that human colonists of New Dakota had occupied Zormach territory illegally and had 4 hours to begin evacuation procedures, and that after that time the Zormach fleet would begin systematic destruction of human installations until compliance was achieved. On the surface of New Dakota, Governor Paul Anderson listened to the message in the Emergency Command Center, and around him displays showed civilian shelters filled to capacity and defense platforms armed and ready, and a population of 40,000 humans who refused to leave their homes. Colonel Amy Foster said the Zormach were giving them 4 hours, and that they were actually being merciful by their standards, and Paul replied that they thought humans would break and run, and he told Amy to send their response. The human reply was brief and clear, saying that New Dakota was legally claimed and settled territory under coalition law, and that they would not evacuate, and that any attack on this colony would be considered an act of war against all of humanity. Kreshitar read the response and felt satisfied because the humans were choosing destruction over wisdom, and their deaths would teach other young species proper respect, and he ordered his fleet to begin bombardment in 4 hours. But something nagged at his tactical sense, and he wondered where the human military ships were, because intelligence reported humans had several dozen warships, but none were present in this system. He ordered his officers to scan for cloaked vessels, and the response came back negative with no contacts anywhere, and the system appeared clear except for the small defense platforms. So Kreshtar ordered them to expand the scan to surrounding systems to make sure no human reinforcements were approaching. The tactical officer began scanning, and then his voice became urgent as he reported massive, faster-than-light signatures on multiple vectors, all converging on their position, and Kreshtar demanded to know how many ships were coming. The tactical officer said the readings showed over 200 distinct signatures and that emergence would occur in 17 minutes, and Kreshtar stared at the display in disbelief, because the humans were not supposed to have 200 military ships. The tactical officer continued reporting, and said the mass readings were inconsistent with standard military vessels, and that some were military grade, but many appeared to be civilian profile ships, and it looked like the entire human merchant fleet had been converted to warships. Kreshtar understood in that moment what was happening, and the understanding brought horror because the humans had not just sent their military, but had armed everything that could fly, and his scales rippled with sudden alertness as he ordered full combat. Alert in fleet formation Delta 7, and told everyone to prepare for immediate engagement. The Zormach warships, which had been positioned for planetary bombardment, now scrambled to combat formation, but they were too close to the planet, and too clustered together and too confident in their superiority, and they were not ready for what came next. Space tore open along 200 different vectors at exactly the same moment, and the human fleet emerged like a swarm, and there were military cruisers, yes, but also bulk freighters with missile pods welded to their hulls and mining ships with drilling lasers retrofitted for combat, and passenger liners converted to drone carriers, and every ship humanity could make space, worthy, and army had come to this system, and they came in complete silence with no demands and no warnings and no speeches, and they simply opened fire. The battle lasted 8 minutes from first shot to final surrender. The Zormach fleet had been caught in terrible positioning and was outnumbered 4-1, and they fought with the desperation of professional warriors who realized too late they had made a catastrophic error, and they managed to destroy 7 human ships in the opening salvos. But the humans fought with cold mechanical precision that spoke of careful planning and absolute commitment. The endless vengeance took fire from 17 different directions at once, and Kreshtar tried to coordinate a fighting retreat, but human ships were already moving to cut off every escape vector, and he realized this was not a battle, but an execution. Kreshtar ordered his communications officer to get a message to the Dominion homeworld, and to warn them that the humans were not what anyone thought and that they were not just defending but hunting. And he tried to say more, but a converted mining ship called Copper Bell fired its industrial particle drills straight through the Endless Vengeance command deck. The last thing Kreshtar saw was the cold stars through the breach in his ship, and his final thought was that perhaps the elder species had been right to fear humanity's emergence into the galaxy. When the firing stopped, there were 0 Zormach ships left operational, and 43 had been destroyed outright, while 4 had surrendered and been taken into custody, and the human fleet had suffered 22 ships destroyed and 38 damaged. But they had achieved total victory. Admiral Richard Hayes commanded the human fleet from the cruiser Determination, and he composed a brief after-action report to be broadcast on all coalition frequencies, and the message said that the Zormach Dominion had launched an unprovoked attack on human territory, and that their fleet had been eliminated, and that humanity would not tolerate violence against lawful settlements, and that any species considering similar action should reconsider carefully. But the human fleet did not stop at New Dakota, because while the Zormach fleet had been engaging the defense force, another 140 human ships had been moving on separate vectors toward other targets, and they emerged at every major Zormach military installation simultaneously. The Zormach home defense fleet scrambled to respond, but they were too late, and human ships swarmed every Zormach orbital station and shipyard and defense platform, and the humans were careful not to target civilian infrastructure or population centers, but every military asset the Zormach possessed was systematically destroyed. The Dominion High Command tried to surrender after 3 hours of this assault, and the human fleet stopped firing immediately, but maintained their positions around every Zormach military facility, and the terms of surrender were broadcast clearly saying complete demilitarization and reparations for all human military expenses, and formal recognition of human territorial claims. The Zormach had no choice but to agree to every demand in the Coalition Assembly Hall. Species that had ignored Vornthax's warnings now watched in stunned silence as reports came in from across Zormach space and the Zormach Dominion, which had been a significant military power for 6,000 years, had been effectively neutralized as a fighting force in less than one standard day. The Varelian security chief asked in a whisper how the humans had mobilized so quickly and how they had coordinated such a massive operation across multiple star systems, and Vornthax, who had been silent since the fighting began, finally spoke and said it was because while the coalition was talking, the humans were doing, and while everyone was debating, the humans were building, and while everyone assumed, their silence meant acceptance. The humans were planning exactly this outcome. The security chief said the coalition must condemn this act of aggression, but Vornthax corrected him sharply and said the humans had responded to an act of aggression, and that the Zormach attacked first and the humans simply responded with overwhelming force exactly as they had warned they would. The security chief insisted they must do something, and Vornthax said flatly that they must do nothing because the coalition had failed in its duty to prevent this conflict and had allowed one member species to threaten another with violence, and had ignored warnings from both history and observation, and if they condemned humanity now, they would face exactly what the Zormach faced, which was a species that had decided talking was pointless. The security chief looked at the tactical displays and noted that the humans had pulled every ship from their defensive perimeters, and that Earth itself was nearly undefended, and suggested that if the coalition moved now, they could force human compliance. Vornthax's response was cold and harsh, and he said that would confirm every dark suspicion humans had about the coalition, and would prove that the coalition only respected force and not law, and that the security chief would discover that humans, when truly threatened, were capable of far worse than what had been witnessed today, and the chief asked what could be worse than the destruction of an entire military fleet. Vornthax pulled up restricted files from human history and showed wars where humans nearly destroyed themselves and weapons that poisoned. 6 weeks after what coalition historians were already calling the New Dakota incident, Vornthax requested a private meeting with the human delegation, and to his surprise they accepted the invitation, and they agreed to meet at a neutral station, away from the assembly hall where quiet discussions could happen without public scrutiny. The meeting place was a small diplomatic outpost where species conducted business away from the attention of the media and the crowds, and Daniel Price arrived, with only Lisa Martin and Jack Sullivan, and they brought no guards and made no show of force, but simply came in their plain diplomatic uniforms. Vornthax brought only his assistant Ralmina, and when they entered the meeting room, the contrast was clear between the ancient alien species and the young humans who had just shocked the entire galaxy. Vornthax began by thanking them for agreeing to meet, and said he knew humanity had little reason to trust coalition officials at present, and Daniel replied simply that they were here and told him to talk. The directness was very human, with no ritual greetings and no ceremonial words, and Vornthax appreciated the efficiency, even though it made him uncomfortable, and he said he wanted to understand something and asked if, when they walked out of the assembly hall, they had already decided everything. Daniel exchanged glances with Lisa and Jack, and said not exactly, and explained that every nation keeps contingency plans for potential conflicts, but that the decision to activate those plans happened when they walked out and that they had options prepared. But the choice to use them was made in that moment. Vornthax asked why they made that choice when the Zormach had not attacked yet, and when diplomatic options still remained, and Lisa responded by asking him a question in return, and she said in that assembly hall they had presented a legal case and followed every procedure and done everything right, and yet the Zormach threatened them with violence and the coalition did nothing. Vornthax started to say the coalition was attempting to mediate, but Jack interrupted and said the coalition was allowing a strong member to threaten a weak one, and that humans were not idiots and knew how the galaxy worked, and that the Zormach had been coalition members for thousands of years, with relationships and trading partners and political connections, while humans were barely in the door, and the coalition was never going to rule. Against the Zormach, Vornthax wanted to deny this, but honesty prevented him, and he admitted that perhaps there would not have been a ruling in humanity's favor, but suggested there could have been compromise. Daniel asked what the compromise would have been and pointed out that humans had legal claims and the Zormach wanted their territory. So what was the middle ground? And should humans give up half their legally settled worlds, or accept that coalition law only protects those strong enough to enforce it themselves? Vornthax suggested they could have accepted disputed status pending review, but Lisa finished his thought and said they could have accepted that they did not really have rights in the coalition, and that all those compromises would have meant their legal claims did not matter. When opposed by established powers, Vornthax was quiet for a moment and then said, "So they decided war was preferable," and Daniel corrected him and said they decided respect was preferable, and that humans were not interested in being feared, but in being taken seriously. He explained that the Zormach thought humans were weak because they were young, and thought they would fold because they lacked coalition connections, and they were wrong, and now everyone knew they were wrong. Vornthax said the humans had destroyed the entire Zormach military capacity and erased centuries of development in a single day, and Jack replied they had destroyed the Zormach ability to threaten them and had not touched civilian infrastructure or targeted populations, and had not turned their worlds into wastelands, and that humans knew how to do total war, but what they did to the Zormach was surgical and limited. Lisa added that it was also terrifying to every other species in the galaxy, and said that was good, because maybe they would think twice before threatening human colonies. Vornthax felt frustration rising and said they did not understand the damage done to galactic stability, and that the coalition had maintained peace for 12,000 years through patient diplomacy, and that humans had introduced unpredictability and violence. Daniel's expression hardened, and he said the coalition had maintained peace by allowing strong species to dominate weak ones and by making newer species accept whatever the established powers allowed, and that this was not peace, but successful bullying. Vornthax started to object, but Daniel leaned forward and asked him to answer honestly, and said, if the Zormach had attacked human colonies and humans had done nothing, would the coalition have come to their defense, and would there have been consequences for the Zormach? Vornthax began to answer, then stopped, because the truth was uncomfortable, and he admitted probably not, and that the coalition rarely intervened in what it considered bilateral disputes. Daniel said then humans were supposed to accept being attacked and accept losing legally settled worlds because they did not have enough political capital in the coalition system, and Vornthax said they were supposed to trust the process. Lisa said flatly that the process failed them, and that this was what the coalition was not understanding, and that they came to the assembly hall in good faith, and presented their case and followed the rules and were threatened with violence, and the response was to suggest they compromise their legal rights, and that was when they knew the system was not designed to protect them but to maintain a status quo where established powers did what they wanted. Ralmina spoke for the first time and said, "So, humans decided to change the status quo through violence." But Jack corrected her and said they decided to change it through demonstration, and that they showed threatening humans has consequences, and that they would not accept being second-class coalition members, and that they had teeth and were willing to use them. Vornthax said humans were following a pattern, and that their history showed this repeatedly, and that when diplomatic systems failed them, they abandoned those systems and resorted to force. Daniel replied that when diplomatic systems failed them, they built new ones, and that sometimes this required breaking the old ones first. Vornthax asked what happens now and said the humans had proven their point and demonstrated that threatening them had consequences. So what came next? Daniel was quiet for several seconds and then said that depended on the coalition, and asked if they were willing to treat humans as equals, and if they were willing to enforce their own laws impartially, regardless of how long a species had been. A member Vornthax said, that was not a simple question, and Daniel replied, it was a very simple question, and that the answer might be complicated, but the question itself was simple. Vornthax admitted honestly that he did not know if the coalition could change that fundamentally, and Daniel said then he would be honest, too, and revealed that humans were preparing to leave the coalition. The words hung in the air, and Ralmina asked in shock if they meant leaving the coalition entirely. Jack explained they were establishing their own regional cooperative, and had been in talks with 17 other younger species who were tired of being treated as junior members, and who wanted a system based on law and not political seniority. and they were calling it the New Worlds Alliance. Vornthax understood immediately and said they were creating a rival power block and were going to fracture the coalition. Lisa corrected him and said they were creating an alternative, and that if the coalition was willing to reform and treat all members equally, then maybe there was a path forward. But if the coalition insisted on maintaining a system where established powers had unofficial privileges, then yes, they were building something else. Vornthax said this would lead to conflict and competing blocks and the breakdown of unified galactic civilization. Daniel suggested it might lead to competition and reform, and that maybe having an alternative would make the coalition better, and that maybe they would realize they needed to deliver on promises of equality and justice if they wanted to retain members. Vornthax asked what it would take for humanity to remain in the coalition, and Daniel said, real reform, with constitutional changes, guaranteeing equal treatment and enforcement mechanisms that did not depend on political connections and a justice system that delivered actual justice and acknowledgement. That might does not make right even when the mighty species has been a member for thousands of years. Vornthax said those were enormous demands, and Daniel replied, then consider them a starting position for negotiation, and that humans were willing to talk and work within the system, but were done being silent when the system failed. Vornthax said he would bring the proposals to the Elder Council but could not promise success, and Daniel said they were not asking for promises but for honest effort. As the meeting ended, Vornthax said that when the humans walked out of the assembly hall in silence, they had terrified him, and that, in 8,000 years of life, he had not felt fear like that. Lisa asked why, and Vornthax explained that silence meant decision, and that when humans decided they acted with totality, that other species could barely comprehend. Daniel smiled and said humans had offered the Zormach chances to surrender, and had stopped firing when they capitulated and could have destroyed them completely, but did not. The Coalition Reform Summit convened 4 months after the New Dakota incident in neutral space, aboard a massive conference station built specifically for this gathering, and representatives from all Coalition member species attended. But everyone understood this summit was really about one question, which was whether the Coalition could adapt to what humans demanded. Vornthax had spent those 4 months in the most intensive political work of his long life, and the Elder Council had resisted, at first, and dismissed human demands as the complaints of an immature species. But then 17 other species formally announced they were joining the New Worlds Alliance, and then economic reports showed human trade had decreased 40% with traditional coalition partners while increasing 300% with alliance members. The message became clear that humans were not bluffing, and they were not alone in their dissatisfaction. The summit opened with representatives from 800 species, and the chamber was arranged in concentric circles with younger species toward the center and elder species around the edges, which was a symbolic reversal of the traditional hierarchy. Daniel Price sat in the centermost circle, surrounded by representatives from the Alliance species, and Lisa Martin and Jack Sullivan sat beside him. And behind them were delegates from the Karvathi and the Shrell and the Marani, and 14 other species who had decided the old order needed changing. Vornthax opened the summit with traditional greetings but moved quickly to the real issues, and he said they faced the first existential crisis in 4,000 years, and that it was not a crisis of war, but a crisis of legitimacy, and that younger members believed the system had failed them, while some elder members believed the system was beyond reform, and they had 6 months to prove both groups wrong. The Vrelian security chief, who had opposed reform at every step, rose to speak and said the coalition had maintained galactic peace for 12,000 years, and that their systems worked, and that this crisis came from one species unwilling to accept compromise, and their resort to violence. Daniel did not rise or make dramatic gestures but simply spoke from his seat, and his voice carried clearly, and he said the coalition had maintained peace by allowing powerful species to dominate weaker ones without consequences, and that human unwillingness to accept that system was not a flaw but a feature. The Vrelian said humans had destroyed an entire fleet over a territorial dispute that could have been mediated, and Daniel replied they had defended legal claims against a threat of violence that should have been condemned by the coalition, and that the fact the Vrelian still framed this as human failure rather than coalition failure showed whether real reform was possible, Vornthax intervened and said this was the conversation they needed, but with less accusation and more substance. And he asked Daniel to present the formal reform proposal. Lisa activated a holographic display that appeared throughout the chamber in every delegate's native language, and she began explaining that the new World's Alliance reform proposal had 7 core elements. The first was constitutional amendment, guaranteeing equal legal protection, regardless of species age or political status, and the second was creation of an independent judiciary with enforcement, powers that could not be overridden by politics. And the third was mandatory arbitration of territorial disputes with binding results. The fourth element was elimination of informal privileges based on seniority or historical relationships, and the fifth was restructuring the Security Council to include rotating seats for younger species. And the sixth was establishment of mutual defense obligations applying equally to all members. And the seventh was regular review of coalition institutions for effectiveness and equity. The chamber erupted with responses, and some species applauded the ambition, while others protested the changes as too radical. And then the Zormach delegates spoke for the first time since their military defeat, and made a surprising statement. The Zormach delegate said his people supported the proposal, and shocked silence followed his words. He continued and said the Zormach had learned a hard lesson and had believed their age and power gave them informal privileges, but were wrong, and that humans had taught them that power must be constrained by law, or it invites destruction, and they supported reform because they did not wish any other species to learn this lesson as painfully as they had. Vornthax felt hope rising, because if the Zormach, who had been humiliated and defeated, could support reform, then perhaps others could as well. But the Vrelian remained unmoved, and said the Zormach supported this because they were defeated, and that the rest of the coalition should not have to remake galactic civilization, because one elder species made a mistake, and one young species overreacted. Jack stood and said, this was not an overreaction, but 37 species representing 12% of coalition population, and 18% of economic output, saying the current system did not work for them, and asked if the Vrelian could dismiss all of them as easily as dismissing humanity. A Karvathi delegate rose and said his people had been coalition members for 3,000 years and long enough to understand the system, and they agreed with humans that informal privileges and political considerations that override law, and the assumption that age equals wisdom, had created a system that stifled progress. And they supported reform. One by one other delegates rose, and some supported reform while others opposed it. But the lines were not simply young versus old, and some elder species seeing the future endorsed change, while some younger species comfortable with the current system resisted it. The debate continued for 3 days and became heated at times, but slowly a consensus began forming. On the 4th day, Vornthax called a private session of only the Elder Council, which included 23 species who had been coalition members for more than 5,000 years, and these were the ones who truly held power. Vornthax told them they faced a choice between resisting reform and watching the coalition fragment, or leading reform and maintaining relevance in a changing galaxy. The Vrelian insisted they had built this coalition and it reflected their values and experience and wisdom earned over millennia, and asked why they should change it to satisfy species barely out of their home systems. Vornthax displayed demographic and economic projections and said those young species were the future, and that in 500 years, the Alliance species would represent 40% of galactic population and 60% of economic activity. And in 1,000 years, they would be the majority, and the choice was to adapt and remain partners, or resist and become irrelevant. The Vrelian said Vornthax was asking them to give up power, and Vornthax corrected him and said he was asking them to share it. An Altheri delegate, who was one of the oldest species, spoke, and said he remembered when the Vrelians were young upstarts demanding reform 7,000 years ago, and the elder species of that time resisted, and the coalition nearly collapsed, and they barely avoided catastrophic fracture. And now they were the elder species, and history was repeating, and the question was whether they were wise enough to learn from it. The debate in the Elder Council was brutal and honest in ways public sessions could never be, And these were species who had shaped galactic civilization for millennia, now confronting that their era of dominance was ending. The Vrelian finally asked the critical question, and said if they supported reform would the humans stay in the coalition. Vornthax admitted he did not know, but said he knew, if they did not support reform, the humans would definitely leave and would take a quarter of the coalition with them. The vote was close, but reform won with 16 elder species supporting change and 7 opposing. When the summit reconvened, Vornthax announced the Elder Council's decision to support the reform proposal with modifications, and the next 4 weeks were spent negotiating details and compromising on implementation and crafting language that balanced idealism with practicality. The final reform accord was less ambitious than the Alliance wanted, but more substantial than conservatives feared, and it guaranteed equal legal protection and created an independent judiciary with real power, and restructured governance to include younger species, but preserved some traditional elements and implemented changes gradually over 50 years. On the final day the vote was called, and each species cast its decision publicly. The Reform Accord passed with 78% support. Daniel stood to address the assembly and said the New Worlds Alliance accepted the accord and would remain coalition members and work within the reformed system, but would maintain their alliance as a caucus representing younger and smaller species, and if reforms failed or promises were not kept, they would revisit the question of separate organization. Vornthax felt relief and exhaustion, and said the coalition thanked the alliance for partnership, and that they all had much work ahead. Later, Vornthax met privately with Daniel one final time, and said the humans had won and forced the most comprehensive reform in coalition history. Daniel said they had not won but negotiated a compromise, and that the accord was less than they wanted, but more than the coalition wanted to give. And that was what compromise looked like. Vornthax said Daniel could have pushed harder with the leverage he had, and Daniel replied that pushing harder would have broken the coalition, and they did not want that, but wanted it to work and deliver on its promises.